Our reading today is found in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 5 through chapter 25, verse 4. This is the word of Yahweh. When a man is newly married, he shall not go out with the army or be charged with any related duty. He shall be free at home 1 year, to be happy with the wife whom he has married. No one shall take a mill or an upper millstone in pledge, for that would be taking a life in pledge. If someone is caught kidnapping another Israelite, enslaving or selling the Israelite, then that kidnapper shall die. So you shall purge the evil from your midst. Guard against an outbreak of a leprous skin disease by being very careful. You shall carefully observe whatever the Levitical priests instruct you, just as I have commanded them. Remember what Yahweh your Elohim did to Miriam on your journey out of Egypt. When you make your neighbor a loan of any kind, you shall not go into the house to take the pledge. You shall wait outside while the person to whom you are making the loan brings the pledge out to you. If the person is poor, you shall not sleep in the garment given you as a pledge. You shall give the pledge back by sunset, so that your neighbor may sleep in the cloak and bless you, and it will be to your credit before Yahweh your Elohim. You shall not withhold the wages of poor and needy laborers, whether other Israelites or aliens who reside in your land in one of your towns. You shall pay them their wages daily before sunset, because they are poor and their livelihood depends on them. Otherwise, they might cry to Yahweh against you, and you would incur guilt. Parents shall not be put to death for their children, nor shall children be put to death for their parents. Only for their own crimes may persons be put to death. You shall not deprive a resident alien or an orphan of justice. You shall not take a widow's garment in pledge. Remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and that Yahweh your Elohim redeemed you from there. Therefore I command you to do this. When you reap your harvest in your field and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be left for the alien, the orphan, and the widow, so that Yahweh your Elohim may bless you in all your undertakings. When you beat your olive trees, do not strip what is left. It shall be for the alien, the orphan, and the widow. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, do not glean what is left. It shall be for the alien, the orphan, and the widow. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore I am commanding you to do this. Suppose two persons have a dispute and enter into litigation, and the judges decide between them, declaring one to be in the right and the other to be in the wrong. If the one in the wrong deserves to be flogged, the judge shall make that person lie down and be beaten in his presence with the number of lashes proportionate to the offense. 40 lashes may be given, but not more. If more lashes than these are given, your neighbor will be degraded in your sight. You shall not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain. When a teacher of the law asked Jesus, "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" The Gospel according to St. Matthew chapter 22 verses 37 through 40 has preserved the following. He, Jesus, said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment, and a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets." When Jesus used the phrase the law and the prophets, he was referring to what we call today the Old or First Testament. And in the original Hebrew arrangement, the First Testament has been organized into 3 sections. The first is the law and includes the 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The second is the prophets and includes all the books which modern Christians would call the Deuteronomic history and the writing prophets. The third is called today the writings, though in Jesus' day the third section was sometimes included in the prophets and other times called simply the Psalms. It includes what Christians today call wisdom literature: Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs, as well as books such as Esther, Ruth, Daniel, Lamentations, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. In short, what Jesus was saying was that the entirety of the First Testament hangs on 2 commands. The first can be found in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 5. This passage is often called the Shema in Jewish tradition, and it reads as follows: "Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our Elohim, Yahweh alone. You shall love Yahweh your Elohim with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might." The second commandment that Jesus mentioned can be found in Leviticus chapter 19, verses 17 to 18, which reads thusly: You shall not hate in your heart any one of your kin. You shall reprove your neighbor, or you will incur guilt yourself. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am Yahweh. The Hebrew word translated into English as love in both verses is the Hebrew word ahev, which refers to showing affection for a person, to caring for a person, to watching over a person. Now, of course, what it means to show affection for someone, or to care for someone, or to watch over someone can differ depending on a person's culture or values. So, the question for those of us who worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who became flesh in the person of Jesus, is this: what does God mean by loving Him and loving our neighbors as ourselves? In terms of loving God, Moses went on to explain what God means by loving Him as follows in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 6 through 9. Keep these words that I am commanding you today in your heart. Recite them to your children, and talk about them when you're at home and when you're away, when you lie down and when you rise. Bind them as a sign on your hand. Fix them as an emblem on your forehead, and write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. And in terms of loving our neighbors as ourselves, Leviticus 19, 17 to 18 has provided us with 4 general applications. We are not to hate our neighbor in our heart. We are to correct our neighbor when she or he goes astray. We are not to take vengeance on our neighbor, and we are not to bear a grudge against our neighbor. All of this is bound up in Jesus' response to a particular teacher of the law in Matthew chapter 22, verses 34 through 40. The greatest commandment, according to Jesus, is to be found in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 9, and the second is to be found in Leviticus chapter 19, verses 17 to 18. Therefore, according to Jesus, God's people are called first to love God by observing all the words He has commanded us, teaching those words to our children, speaking about them during the course of our lives every day, and allowing them to guide our hands, to direct our vision, to guide our home lives, and to guide the governance of our communities. And, according to Jesus, God's people are called second to love their neighbors as themselves by not hating our neighbors in our hearts, by correcting our neighbors when they depart from God's requirements, by refusing to take vengeance on them, and by refusing to bear grudges against them. According to Jesus, all the teachings of the First Testament hang on these 2 commandments. What we began by reading in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 5 through chapter 25, verse 4, is a more detailed description of what God means when He tells us to love our neighbors as ourselves, by not hating them in our hearts, by correcting them when they go astray, by not taking vengeance against them, and by not bearing grudges against them. First, God explains further as follows: When a man is newly married, he shall not go out with the army or be charged with any related duty. He shall be free at home 1 year, to be happy with the wife whom he has married. The first way that God required the Israelites to love their neighbors as themselves in this passage was to allow a newly married man to be exempted from military service for 1 year. Some commentators have suggested that this was a way to ensure that each man had opportunity to produce a child before risking his life in war, and it seems plausible that such a hope may be involved in this commandment. But whatever the underlying purpose of this legislation may have been, at the very least, we must accept that the freedom to enjoy one's first year of marriage, without being required to risk one's life in war or to spend weeks or months living remotely for the sake of the security of one's community or nation, is part of what God meant when He commanded the Israelites to love their neighbors as themselves. We should observe that no such allowance is afforded to newly married members of the United States military today. Second, according to Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 6, loving one's neighbor as oneself also required the following: No one shall take a mill or an upper millstone in pledge, for that would be taking a life in pledge. In his commentary on Deuteronomy in the New International Commentary on the Old Testament series, Dr. Peter Craigie has explained this law as follows: In every Israelite family home, a small milling machine would be a basic and essential part of culinary equipment. Each morning, the housewife would use it to prepare flour in order to provide the family with its daily bread. Thus, to take the millstones, or even just the upper stone, which would make the machine useless, would be to cause real hardship to the family and would be contrary to the spirit of generosity which should characterize the lender. Taking a life in pledge. The sense is taking in pledge a means of livelihood. In ancient Israel, as today, loans often required collateral to be approved. God, however, prohibited those who would loan money or items not only from collecting interest, as we observed in a previous discussion, but also from requiring collateral that was essential to a family's daily sustenance or survival. Again, this is part of what God meant when He commanded His people to love their neighbors as themselves. One wonders how God feels about the standard practice in contemporary societies of holding as collateral one's house in order to secure financing for a mortgage. Third, according to Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 7, loving one's neighbor as oneself required the following. If someone is caught kidnapping another Israelite, enslaving or selling the Israelite, then that kidnapper shall die. So you shall purge the evil from your midst. We might remember that on another occasion, Jesus was asked, "Who is my neighbor?" In response, Jesus told a parable of a man who was mugged and left for dead on his way from Jericho to Jerusalem. In that parable, the man was passed by all but a man who would have been expected at the time to hate him. Jesus concluded by asking who had been a neighbor to the man who was in need. In that parable, Jesus, of course, shifted the question from, "Who is my neighbor?" to the question, "How might I be a neighbor to one who is in need?" But in addition to that important shift in focus, Jesus also emphasized a principle that had long been part of God's covenant with Israel, namely, that the one being oppressed or victimized should be cared for by the communal pursuit of justice against their assailant. To put the matter bluntly, loving one's neighbor as oneself did imply that one was to seek justice for victims of unlawful assaults. But loving one's neighbor as oneself did not imply that perpetrators of crimes should be protected from the lawful consequences of what they had done. Fourth, according to Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 8 through 9, loving one's neighbor as oneself required the following. Guard against an outbreak of a leprous skin disease by being very careful. You shall carefully observe whatever the Levitical priests instruct you, just as I have commanded them. Remember what Yahweh your Elohim did to Miriam on your journey out of Egypt. A leprous skin disease in this passage referred to a contagious skin disease. When God had afflicted Moses' sister Miriam with such a disease, as detailed in Numbers chapter 12, verses 10 through 16, God required that Miriam be quarantined and placed in isolation from others for 7 days. Therefore, God has explained to Israel that loving one's neighbor as oneself does require a person afflicted with a contagious disease to isolate him or herself so as to avoid passing the disease to others. But at the same time, loving one's neighbor as oneself does not require the community to allow the diseased person to live in their midst despite the contagious affliction. More plainly, a person with a contagious disease must love their neighbors as themselves by cooperating with the community's requirement of quarantine or self-isolation. Likewise, the community is to love their neighbor as themselves by requiring the quarantining of any who have contracted deadly or chronic diseases which are communicable. Fifth, according to Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 10 through 13, loving one's neighbor as oneself requires the following. When you make your neighbor a loan of any kind, you shall not go into the house to take the pledge. You shall wait outside, while the person to whom you are making the loan brings the pledge out to you. If the person is poor, you shall not sleep in the garment given you as the pledge. You shall give the pledge back by sunset, so that your neighbor may sleep in the cloak and bless you, and it will be to your credit before Yahweh your Elohim. Again, Dr. Craigie has explained this requirement as follows. This requirement protects the privacy of the recipient's home and leaves to him the choice of the article to be given as collateral for the loan. It means that a man can borrow with honor, without having his personal possessions made open to the creditor for his selection of an item to be taken in pledge. In the case of a very poor man, he would only have his garment to offer as pledge. The garment is a blanket-like piece of clothing used as a cloak by day and as a bed covering by night. You shall not sleep in his pledge. That is, where the creditor took a garment in pledge, he was not to put it to his own use at night, thereby depriving the borrower of his only protection against the chill night air. The spirit of both parts of this legislation breathes the humanity and charity that were to characterize the covenant community of God. There would inevitably be needy people among the Israelites, but their hardship would be alleviated by legislation such as this, which reflected in its terms the covenant love of God for his people. That's the end of the quotation. According to God, impoverished people with very little collateral were still to be provided loans in Israel, but the creditor was never to deprive a person of dignity or well-being. According to God, lending to the poor, protecting the dignity of the poor, and showing compassion for the suffering of the poor was part of what it means to love one's neighbor as oneself. On the other hand, a creditor's desire to protect his or her investment, or to profit off of the practice of loaning wealth, goods, or items, was not of first priority in a nation that loves their neighbors as themselves. Sixth, according to Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 14 to 15, loving one's neighbor as oneself also requires the following. You shall not withhold the wages of poor and needy laborers, whether other Israelites or aliens who reside in your land in one of your towns. You shall pay them their wages daily before sunset, because they are poor, and their livelihood depends on them. Otherwise, they might cry to Yahweh against you, and you would incur guilt. By way of contemporary restatement, God has said that those who live by the law of loving their neighbors as themselves will pay working-class laborers their wages every day before sunset, whether those laborers are citizens or immigrants. If an employer does not do this, and these laborers cry out to the Lord, God has warned that he will take the side of the laborers. Seventh, according to Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 16, loving one's neighbor as oneself requires the following. Parents shall not be put to death for their children, nor shall children be put to death for their parents. Only for their own crimes may persons be put to death. Now, not every crime was a capital offense in Israel, of course. But in the case of capital offenses, that is, criminal acts for which the covenant of Sinai required the death penalty, parents were never to be executed because of the crimes of their children. The Hebrew word translated children by the New Revised Standard Version is the word bain, which means literally sons, and does not necessarily refer to young children. Sons refers more commonly to children considered adults in ancient Israel, that is, children who were 13 or older. However, the sins of infant or prepubescent children might have affected their parents, or the sins of parents might have affected their dependent children in Israel. In the case of adult children, parents and children were to be tried only for their own sins, not for the sins of family members. Again, according to God, this is part of what it means to love one's neighbor as oneself. Eighth, according to Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 17 to 18, loving one's neighbor as oneself requires the following. You shall not deprive a resident alien or an orphan of justice. You shall not take a widow's garment in pledge. Remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and Yahweh your Elohim redeemed you from there. Therefore I command you to do this. Here we see that God required the Israelites to consider immigrants who lived in their land, orphans and widows, as neighbors for whom they were to care. Consequently, they were to ensure the same justice for immigrants, orphans, and widows as citizens and landowners were afforded in Israel. Why did God require this? Because the Israelites were to remember that at one time they too had been immigrants in another country, and that country had not afforded them justice, but instead enslaved them. They were never to repeat such behavior with immigrants and the disenfranchised in their own country. Loving one's neighbor as oneself according to God requires a nation to afford non-citizens and those without power or representation the same justice afforded to citizens and to the powerful in their land. Again, our own cultures could stand to hear this warning again. Ninth, according to Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 19 through 22, Loving one's neighbor as oneself requires the following. When you reap your harvest in your field and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be left for the alien, the orphan, and the widow, so that Yahweh your Elohim may bless you in all your undertakings. When you beat your olive trees, do not strip what is left. It shall be for the alien, the orphan, and the widow. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, do not glean what is left. It shall be for the alien, the orphan, and the widow. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore, I am commanding you to do this. According to God, loving one's neighbor as oneself requires us not to hoard all of our wealth for ourselves. In the case of the farmers of ancient Israel, they were prohibited from harvesting their fields more than once. Incidentally, this may also have been part of the reason God prohibited them from sowing different kinds of seed in the same field. Whatever remained after the initial harvest was to be left for immigrants, orphans, and widows, that is, for the disenfranchised or the dispossessed. According to God, anyone who wishes to live by the law of loving one's neighbor as oneself must not be one who carefully collects all that is due to them and carefully hoards all that belongs to them. Again, God reminded the Israelites that such is how the Egyptians acted in relation to them, and they were never to repeat similar behavior themselves. 10th, according to Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 1 through 3, loving one's neighbor as oneself requires the following. Suppose two persons have a dispute and enter into litigation, and the judges decide between them, declaring one to be in the right and the other to be in the wrong. If the one in the wrong deserves to be flogged, the judge shall make that person lie down and be beaten in his presence with the number of lashes proportionate to the offense. 40 lashes may be given, but not more. If more lashes than these are given, your neighbor will be degraded in your sight. Again, we find Dr. Craigie's explanation helpful in understanding these requirements. He has written the following. The substance of this legislation makes it very clear that corporal punishment was subject to many safeguards designed to avoid its abuse. Corporal punishment could be inflicted only after proper trial, and then it was to be carried out within the specified limit under the supervision of the judge. In this way, care was taken to see that the punishment was appropriate to the crime on the one hand, and that the criminal was not grossly maltreated on the other hand. The guilty party was still your brother, a fellow Israelite, and was not to be publicly humiliated. According to God, loving one's neighbor did not require crimes to be overlooked or left unpunished. However, the prosecution and punishment of people was not to be handed out at the whims of the offended party. God required a judicial system to be established. He required any punishment to be overseen by the judge who passed the verdict, and he required the punishment to safeguard the dignity of the person being punished. As offensive as corporal punishment may seem to contemporary societies, one wonders if contemporary practices of lengthy incarceration along with the subjection of inmates to ongoing abuse from other inmates and in some cases guards meet these standards of God for criminal punishments. And if this sounds more like a civil case, one wonders if extreme financial burdens placed on people who are incapable of paying them or whose life is severely impoverished or compromised because of these judgments, if that meets the standards of God for criminal punishments, that safeguards the dignity of the person who is being punished and ensures that they are treated as a fellow brother, as a neighbor who needs to be loved. 11th, according to Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 4, loving one's neighbor as oneself requires the following. You shall not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain. Perhaps most surprising is that, taken at face value, this stipulation seems to suggest that even animals in Israel were to be considered in some sense neighbors. In this case, one was not to try to prevent oxen from eating some of the grain that they were being used to thresh. The principle that was drawn from this stipulation later by St. Paul the Apostle was that those who work should be compensated for their labor. St. Paul discussed this principle in two New Testament passages. The first can be found in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 3 through 12, which reads as follows. This is my defense to those who would examine me. Do we not have the right to our food and drink? Do we not have the right to be accompanied by a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living? Who at any time pays the expenses for doing military service? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat any of its fruit? Or who tends a flock and does not get any of its milk? Do I say this on human authority? Does not the law also say the same? For it is written in the law of Moses, "You shall not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain." Is it for oxen that God is concerned? Or does he not speak entirely for our sake? It was indeed written for our sake, for whoever plows should plow in hope, and whoever threshes should thresh in hope of a share in the crop. If we have sown spiritual good among you, is it too much if we reap your material benefits? If others share this rightful claim on you, do not we still more? Nevertheless, we have not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. St. Paul lived as a celibate, single man throughout his Christian ministry, and rather than receiving pay from those among whom he ministered, he most often supported himself through tent making and tent repair, which had been his trade prior to becoming an apostle of Jesus. Apparently, this had led some Christian communities to refuse to pay those who ministered among them or to suggest that they should not marry. Paul chastises any such notions, insisting that he has only behaved in these ways to make it easier on the communities he serves. But according to St. Paul, Deuteronomy 25 verse 4 prohibits Christian communities from making these voluntary sacrifices mandatory. Quite to the contrary, according to St. Paul, Christians are prohibited from muzzling those who work for them by not paying them or by requiring them to forego marriage. This issue was so important to St. Paul that he addressed it again in 1 Timothy chapter 5 verses 17 to 18 when he wrote the following: "Let the elders who rule well be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in preaching and teaching. For the scripture says, 'You shall not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain,' and the laborer deserves to be paid." It seems to me that the penchant in contemporary religious communities for free, unpaid volunteer labor, whether from clergy or from the laity, whenever it is expected or required, is a clear violation of God's understanding of what it means to love our neighbors as ourselves. What does it mean to love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength? According to Jesus, it means what the First Testament says it means. And the First Testament has said that loving God means observing all the words He has commanded us and keeping them in our hearts. It means teaching them to our children. It means speaking about God's words every day, no matter where we are or what we're doing. And it means allowing God's words to dictate what we do, how we think, how we behave in our homes, and how we govern our communities. And most of what God has required us to do involves loving our neighbors as ourselves in the ways He has explained to us in the Scriptures. In short, we are never to hate our neighbor in our hearts, we are never to take vengeance against our neighbor, nor are we ever to hold a grudge against our neighbor. Even more, we are to reprove or to correct our neighbor if they transgress God's words. If we do not, then God says in Leviticus chapter 19 verse 18, we ourselves will incur guilt. May those who have ears to hear listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. Amen.